G'day and welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to do a video on, a little bit of help for the industry, a little bit of help for the individuals about bedding your rifle. And it's come to my attention recently, or just this week actually, a conversation with a gunsmith battling with a problem created by another gunsmith in truth, but something that you get to run into. Gunsmiths will see periodically about a mistake made in a normal normal bedding process. To briefly explain what bedding is, this is a Hauer sitting here, and the Hauer and the Ruger actions, the Ruger 77, are more typical of what the problem we're actually talking about is. But for this moment, here's another. This is the Remington 700. The bedding is talking about making basically glass bedding, so epoxy, a resin of some form or other, filling up the voids between your action, recoil lug, and whatever form that is, and whatever style it is, between that and your actual rifle stock. So this is a Remington 700, and I've got this one here to show a little bit later on. But this is one out of this is a Police Special 308, but that's what that action is. And then in front of us we have a HS Precision stock and a Hauer long action rifle in this. Just sitting in there at the moment, but yes, the job would be to take this into full precision. Is you would take, this is the action. These are an investment casting process, so they're not round, they're square, they're nice and flat. They have a bolt in the front, which is actually in their recoil lug, you see underneath here, and another bolt at the rear. And if you're going to go through the bedding process, which I'm not going to do in the way of show that sort of stuff, there's lots of videos that go through the different ways of being very thorough about doing it. But in truth, there's lots of videos that make the same mistake that people are making. But what you would do in that situation is you would clean this all up inside here, give yourself some more clearance in places or whatever you need to make sure your bedding is going to go in the right place. You then would put a release agent, or whatever form it is. There's lots of different styles, from neutral shoe polish to one-shot Hornady, the case lube, to proper release agents. Not something I'm into advising information on. There's lots of different choices depending on what you're using, depending on the resin you're using as well. The last one I was actually dealing with, they had used DevCon, which is an epoxy with sort of metal in it, so it's very, very solid, does a very thorough job of bedding, probably too thorough in some cases, but when you get into the rest when we get to where we're going, you'll see what I'm actually talking about. But you then clear it out, you put with the release agent on here, you put your epoxy in here, tape off, block off what you're going to need to put it all together. Then the most common thing you'll see, and YouTube is probably to the blame for this, where people are learning this sort of thing, but maybe just that where they've been taught, is they'll then take their action, they'll feed it down inside here, so they get the action in there. Then in this sort of situation, they'd be putting in their bottom metal, and then put in the action screws, and nip them up to tension, and then let it dry. After that, pull it all to pieces. If they use the right release agent, then they'd be able to pull that all back out. Then they go through a clean up and they're all done in theory. There's a little to massive problem involved with that process I just showed you. On all actions is there's this problem. Less an issue if you're pillar bedding at the same time and that sort of stuff, but a normal rifle like this, where we're just going through and bedding the actual action, or in this case just bedding the recoil lug, there's a problem that we haven't actually addressed properly, and that is underneath here, especially on a Ruger 77 or a Weatherby or a Hauer or that sort of stuff, or anything that has in the recoil lug has the one of the hold down bolts, one of the action bolts are inside there, is that if you put goop in here, you pushed it down, and then you push your action bolt up inside here, what happened through that process is you've pushed a bit of the gunk, bit of the epoxy up into those threads. And you'll actually, I thought, okay, this is a problem that I realized a long time ago, and really haven't bothered with it since I do it the way I do it when I bed actions, which isn't all the time. I'll get into that in a little bit. But when you push it up in there, a little bit or a lot goes up into that thread. So you push it up into here. And that's exactly what this gunsmith had run into. The previous gunsmith that had done this action bedding job and set this rifle up at great expense, actually, but had done exactly that. And by pushing that action bolt with some gunk up into here, turns into a device that is forcing that DevCon, in that case, up into up inside this part of the action, which is where your barrel tenon is. That's where your threads are. That's how the barrel is held into the action, is a whole heap of threads in here. This forced that DevCon up in there to where it pushes it all around those 3 or 4 threads, and it'll actually keep on winding to where it's got pictures of that thread was totally covered, immersed in DevCon. Took a lot of heat, a lot of effort, a lot of machining to get it all apart, and ended up with damaged threads inside the action getting it apart. Because it was DevCon, it would have been not quite so bad if it wasn't DevCon with the metal inside there, but still a fundamental error. As to getting it apart, that sort of thing has destroyed actions before today. It can also happen a little bit on the other side of things when people put too much Loctite or too longer bolts or things in their rail. You put Loctite on there too much and push it down into the top here, that front rail screw also goes into that thread. So you can be putting in stuff that shouldn't be in there by doing the same sort of thing. It's careful those threads are inside that action. For this problem here, there's actually a simple fix. There's a simple thing to do. I see it done badly I went through half a dozen videos on YouTube and didn't see anyone doing it correctly. So I thought it's like a community service to go through and show how to do this correctly. There's a couple of fundamental mistakes in the situation. One of them is actually holding your action down with torqued action screws while you're going through the bedding process isn't doing the job the way it should be done. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get your action to sit into your stock, chassis, whatever it is, and yes, chassis as well, trying to get it to sit in there in a neutral form. So it's not distorted, and the chassis or the stock isn't distorted. If there is anything that's not perfectly lined up and you're torquing it up on the screws, then you're distorting it. So if you do that while you're setting your bedding in there, then you're actually bedding it in a distorted fashion. So that isn't the correct thing to do. You want to make sure it goes in and it's stable. And then when you actually do your setting, I just use some soft G clamps. You can use ocky straps. You can use stretchy string. You just want to hold that together firmly, but where it's not firm enough to cause any distortion, just to make sure it's firm. The resin then is going to fill up all the voids, make it all straight, and then they're both in neutral places. When it's all hard, when you torque it, you're torquing it to the resin, so then it's all neutral, it's just simply torqued. If you're doing it up in your action screws, then you're actually not doing your job as thoroughly as you could be, so you don't want to torque it too much. And that moves into it's very easy to do this job much more thoroughly, where you don't use action screws. Get yourself a couple of long bolts. These are ones I prepared earlier. These are just a couple of studs. If you have a close look at them, you'll see, well, these are a couple of bolts. I've cut the end off, so I've only got a few threads on the thread, and I've cut the other end off and rounded off so that it's just a stud. What I do is when I'm going to do a bedding job, all the rest of it, all the prep's the same, all those bits and pieces the same, release agent the same. The only thing is I'll tend to put a tiny bit of grease. You could use a low yield Loctite if you wanted to. I tend to use a tiny bit of grease where I screw it in there like that. So the studs, these studs, which is what they turn into, blind studs, go in and sit like that. Release agent on them, a little bit of grease on the thread, a little bit of something on the thread to stop goo going up inside the threads. But I do that. With all the preps, that's what I do. Then I'll simply, with the epoxy in there all set up, all as everyone else is doing it, then push this down inside here. Any of the goo that's in the road is going to get pushed through the side, but then it's all nice and clear and easy. Don't need to do anything more than that. Push it down, make sure it's settled properly, then put on your rocky straps or your soft clamps or whatever it is, hold down there so it's just firm, everything's squeezed out, everything's supposed to be, then let it set. Then it's all set, you can pull that all out, and whether you're taking the screws out in there or to get it out or sliding up through, it doesn't really matter. You get it out, you can pull these out. There's no thread in the wrong places. There's no stuff forced up into your tenon thread. Everything's exactly where it should be. And you have done that easily with a couple of studs. Obviously, you need to get the right studs to suit your rifle. But with these particularly, because even if you're just doing your recoil lug bedding, it answers that problem really nicely. And like I said, with a full bed, you don't want to be tightening down on your action screws. You want the bedding to be settling properly around where everything is otherwise. If you need it down on the post, that sort of stuff, that's still going to happen by you actually using, like I said, all the other forms rather than your action screws to torque it down. So you're not getting any torques in places. You've got two neutral things you can end up clamping together. So I'll put this one back in here so it's not floating around my hands. This matters in different forms. It also matters in another form, which I've also seen and heard of with a Remington 700. Even though the front action screw is not in your recoil lug, it's not in that same place, there's actually been instances where people have done it, and whether you do bolt in or bolt out, that's up to everyone's with the way they're doing things. But I've actually seen people who've gone through this whole process in a Remington 700, and then they've forced goo up into where your bolt's supposed to go into. So then they will put it all together, it's all done, it's all cleaned up, it's all wonderful. They go to put a round in there and they go forward with their bolt and try and close it. It won't go because they've got gunk inside their action through doing the same thing. So exactly the same process, I'll leave that there. Exactly the same process, it's different thread, Howes and metric, the Remington 700 and Imperial, but the same process. You would go through that process there and get, that just about fits, and make some studs up to do exactly the same thing, clamp it down exactly the same way, and you will have it answered very, very nicely without that fuss of that gunk in there. And in the instance I'm talking about, very expensive job to fix. Once there's gunk inside there, lots of work. I've definitely seen where people have had to cut the barrel off and then bore out the thread and then bore it out and then peel the thread out of it and then clean and then chase the thread, set it all up. You can spend hundreds, of dollars to go through a process of getting an action that simply should have been a 5-minute job to spin the barrel out, turned into a monster job with damage, with repairs. Might never quite be the same. It'll still generally get back to the right place. And I've also seen where actions have been destroyed through the same process. So listen, like I said, a bit of just a better way to do things. Generally, I see when people are doing pillar bedding, then it's answered by the fact the pillars are all screwed in their action screws and doing that side of things. This is more for just the normal action. And in exactly this sort of rifle, where it actually is set up where it already has a aluminium chassis inside there. It already has pillars and that sort of stuff. So the bedding is generally going to be happening on the top around this just to finish it off and take it to that extra level of rifle. But it has that potential issue of what we're talking about. The other thing I wanted to say, and I did mention then, that stock or chassis. Yes, there are chassis that not uncommon for a chassis to be able to benefit out of bedding as well. Generally using something like the DevCon, but really it's the same process. You want to make sure you have clearance for the epoxy or the bog or whatever it is you're putting in there to be able to settle in and grip to the chassis and fill up the voids. And why would you do it with a chassis? Because chassis is designed to go straight in. You listen to the ads and they're designed to be a straight fit up. Listen, they sort of are. Using V-blocks and bits and pieces, there is that nature of them that certainly does that. But you'll find that especially when you're dealing with factory actions versus custom actions, factory actions like this Remington 700 action, they aren't as round and dead straight as a custom action. You'll tend to find little bits of deviation in them where they bolt into a chassis that was built for a very exacting tolerances, where factories don't tend to have quite those exacting tolerances. Now, it doesn't matter. I'm not trying to pick on the factory side of things. What I'm saying is don't just assume because it's a chassis, it's going to not be able to benefit from some bedding or some machining or some truing, all those sort of things. The simple way to know this process, and we'll go back to putting this one in here, is that before you do your bedding job, if you do your bedding job, it's done. But you can do up either end of your action. I tend to do the front, but really doesn't matter. You do up one of the screws, and then if there's any spring or movement, where as you do it up, you see the action move slightly one direction, or you see it move here, or you feel it tighten up, and you can feel it get tighter in as you do this, so that you can feel it pulling in. That means it's not bedding properly to the action. That means there's some discrepancy in the difference between one line to the other line. I do that on both ends and see how it sits. It should just do up, and at moderate, as you're coming up on tension, nothing's moving, nothing feels like it's twisting, nothing feels like it's doing anything. There are some folks, and it doesn't work too bad, just to do it up tighter, and it answers it because it's an aluminium thing, so it'll bend to shape. Yes, listen, that can sort of work. It isn't the same, and it isn't as consistent. There is a stress you've got in there, which is not necessarily your friend, or more likely to be not your friend. So to get it so it's neutral, sometimes it can simply be going through and taking a little tiny bit of metal out of something. There is sometimes where you'll go through and bed them. Tend to use a metal form of like DevCon, which is a metal substitute sort of epoxy, and using that with an aluminium chassis works really well. But listen, all things will work. All things work nicely, including bedding, recoil lugs and all that sort of stuff. Why would you just bed a recoil lug? For those people want to know, is if you have movement like this here, which this chassis does, as you can see, you can hear that click, click, click of the action moving backwards and forwards. Potentially, when it goes bang, it bounces a tiny bit. And that means that it could then be 5 thou off the recoil lug, 10 thou off the reload lug, 2 thou off the recoil lug, 0 thou off the recoil lug. And if it's got that tiny bit of movement every time it goes bang, and it's a different tiny bit of movement every time, you're going to get a different outcome. I've got that balanced a bit wrong. You're going to get a different outcome as to where it actually ends up hitting. So it is relevant to go through and do so there isn't the movement type thing, so that it is going to be consistent. Those are important things to do in what you're up to. So bedding is relevant, but this little story wasn't going to go further into the bedding side of things. This little story is to go through and say that, listen, if you're using action screws to just do a bedding job, be it just the recoil lug or a full bedding job, and using action screws to hold it down, there is generally, I won't say always, it depends on your specific situation, but generally there's a better way to do it. Anyway, this was just a general talk about it in the way of trying to offer a better solution than what I see quite commonly put out there, and something to think about. Where the rest of that epoxy goes, it matters in some of those places, and the way I get around that little problem is with these little studs. Anyway guys, thanks for checking in. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you next time.